So Ephraim has put before us a number of complex questions about martyrdom. In my paper, I will primarily address matters having to do with courage. So he mentioned that I was a moral theologian, so I use the work of Aquinas a great deal. So I want to turn to that, and maybe, certainly there are some ambiguities about the nature of martyrdom. Perhaps those can be somewhat clarified by thinking about courage with respect to martyrs. So that is, what is the sort of courage that the martyrs have? So the paper today is called What to Die For, the Courage of Warriors and Martyrs. So one of the things that I would like to do over the course of the paper is think about courage as it originally arose, particularly in its Greek context, courage in war. So what are the differences then between the courage of the martyrs and courage in war? So I'll read most of the paper. If I run over time, I should get my watch out here, and then maybe I can cut some things. But maybe stop along the way just to make some observations. So the first section of the paper is called On Courage or Fortitude or Bravery. So I'll be using Aquinas, and his term is fortitude. He uses that more than courage, but I think we use courage more, and I'll think of them as interchangeable, even though there might be some distinctions. So perhaps we should begin with a little background about courage. St. Thomas Aquinas pairs courage, or fortitude as he calls it, with the cardinal virtue called temperance. Both are about reason, as it engages with the passions or appetites. In this, they are unlike the two cardinal virtues called justice and prudence. Justice is about the operations, and prudence is about reason itself as it moves towards action. As to the other two, this is how Aquinas describes them. The need of putting the order of reason into the passions is due to their thwarting reason, and this occurs in two ways. First, by the passions inciting to something against reason, and then the passions needing a curb, which is called temperance. Secondly, by the passions withdrawing from following the dictate of reason through fear or danger or of toil. And then man needs to be strengthened for that which reason dictates, lest he turn back. And to this end, there is fortitude. So fortitude has the function of, when we draw back, of helping us to move forward or stand firm. The passions to which temperance and fortitude apply divide into two groups, the concupiscible and the irascible. The sexual passions, for instance, are typically concupiscible. That is, they are strong and tend to take us over, driving us forward to grasp what we desire. The effect of the irascible passions, those with which fortitude or courage is concerned, is the opposite. They make us draw back. Fear does this especially. It responds to what is dangerous by urging us to flee. Now, it is easy to see courage has to do with strengthening us so as not to be swept away by fear. But this does not suffice to tell us, really, what courage is. First of all, courage does not erase fear. It rather responds rightly to it. A person who has no fear is not courageous, but rather rash or crazy. Since, in fact, there are things in the world of which we should be afraid. The courageous person knows how rightly to be afraid and also how to rightly respond to true fear as it arises. These points suggest that judgments about courage really are somewhat subjective. This can make modern people suspicious of the virtues. Give us some clear moral rules, please, because we have moral problems to solve. That's typically, I think, our moral attitude, our attitude presently about morality. But it is not possible to lay down a clear set of rules you can follow to be courageous, or even to know what courage is. It takes training and judgment and illustration. So how can we proceed? Jean Porter, a moral theologian at the University of Notre Dame, has suggested that as we think about the virtues, we must also think about what she calls paradigmatic acts. The idea is this: to know courage involves, to know what courage involves, we need at the very least to attend to circumstances in which the virtue of courage is paradigmatically displayed. And this is in circumstances relating to death. And again from Aquinas. Fortitude of the soul must be that which binds the will firmly to the good of reason in face of the greatest evils. Because he that stands firm against great things will in consequence stand firm against less things, but not conversely. Moreover, it belongs to the notion of virtue that it should regard something extreme, and the most fearful of all bodily evils is death, since it does away all bodily goods. Therefore, the virtue of fortitude is about the dangers of death. Aquinas does not mean that the person who has the virtue of fortitude or courage is not brave in other things. Rather, her courage is, to use Porter's term, paradigmatically displayed in connection to dangers of death. To put this point with the previous one, the paradigmatic display of courage is also what helps us identify it, since it is not otherwise definable in a set of propositions or rules. So death and how we face it is, for Aquinas at least, absolutely central to how we think about courage. Other instances of courage, let us say in the face of fear or injury or shame or ridicule, are best identified after we have thought about courage and how it responds to death. Now, Aquinas is not alone in this way of thinking. In fact, he inherited it as he did many things from Aristotle. So from Aristotle, with what sort of terrible things then is the brave man concerned, says he? Now death is the most terrible of all things. But the brave man would not seem to be concerned even with death in all circumstances, but in the noblest. Now such deaths are those in battle, for these take place in the greatest and noblest danger. And these are correspondingly honored in city-states and at the courts of monarchs. Properly, then, he will be called brave or courageous, who is fearless in face of a noble death and of all emergencies that involve death, and the emergencies of war are in the highest degree of this kind. So not just any death displays courage, but rather those under the noblest circumstances, namely death in battle, or so according to Aristotle. Now, Aquinas was a Christian and Aristotle was not. Moreover, he wrote within a tradition, Aquinas did, in which the Christian martyrs had long been honored as paragons of virtue. Aristotle did not know the martyrs and gave them no thought, and so moved along in his thinking about courage in ways that fit his Greek inheritance. Turning to death in battle as the defining context for courage. But for Aquinas and the rest of us Christians, I submit, we need to ask, how can martyrdom help us rethink courage? So now I'd like to spend a little time thinking about Aquinas on death in battle and in martyrdom. So Aquinas will make a distinction actually between the two kinds, what he ends up calling two kinds of courage. So what does Aquinas do as he thinks through the inherited Greek ideas about courage theologically and in the light of the martyrs? As we have seen, he retains the idea that it is in the face of death that courage is best exemplified. Moreover, he does not discard the idea that this is displayed especially in battle. Rather, his emendations come on two main points. First, he expands the idea of what is properly called a battle. And second, he introduces a distinction in courage, seeing it as having two parts. Courage in attacking, or what he sometimes calls aggressive courage, and courage in enduring. Of these, he thinks the second is the greater and more exemplary form. It's a very crucial move. So courage attacking, courage in enduring, and the latter is the greater. Aquinas was not a pacifist, but rather a just warrior, in one sense the original just warrior. He believes that states are justified in going to war under certain carefully circumscribed circumstances, all relating to justice. It is not our concern today to elaborate these conditions, but they stand in the background as he considers courage in war, which he will do. As he says, the dangers of death which occur in battle come to man directly on account of some good, because, to wit, he is defending the common good by a just fight. So Aquinas does not leave aside questions of why one is in the midst of the battle in his treatment of the paradigmatic acts of courage. It is not enough to say that one behaves gallantly as one faces death on the battlefield. One must go further to explain why it is good that he is there in the first place. And the reason must rest on that this is a just fight in defense of the common good. The scope of this point is quite broad. For men are not infrequently praised for their courage on the battlefield when fighting in what was clearly an unjust cause. There will be debate about this, of course, but to invoke two relatively non-controversial cases, we can say that for Aquinas, it is not possible for German soldiers in World War II, nor for Confederate soldiers in the American Civil War to display courage, at least in the paradigmatic sense. The point also makes room for another, namely that the pursuit of justice and the common good might take us into a variety of kinds of battles, quote unquote, where death threatens. These are not confined for Aquinas to the conventional combat with swords and spears. As he goes on to say, now a just fight is of two kinds. First, there is the general combat, for instance, of those who fight in battle. Secondly, there is the private combat, as when a judge or even a private individual does not refrain from giving a just judgment through fear of the impending sword or any other danger, though it threaten death. Hence, it belongs to fortitude to strengthen the mind against dangers of death, not only such as arise in general battle, but also such as occur in singular combat, which may be called by the general name of battle. The expansion of the term battle gives us room to think about courage more broadly, although still also in connection with the dangers of death. For instance, Aquinas mentions not failing to attend on a sick friend through fear of deadly infection, or, as we might think just now, of pursuing good and truthful investigative reporting about the unjust conduct of oppressive regimes. These moves are significant since they take the spotlight of courage off the glory of war, and as such allow a significant divergence from the Greek inheritance, which we'll look at in just a moment. Something that move, something, as we shall see later, the Bible, including the Old Testament, also does. So I want to argue that while we certainly have battles in the Bible, there's a spotlight that's taken off the glory of war that one finds elsewhere. The second significant change, so the first is the broadening of the notion of battle. Now, the second significant change that Aquinas works as he inherits Aristotle's ideas about courage is he distinguishes between courage of the attacking sort and courage of the enduring sort. In the face of the dangers of death, when our cause is just, we are faced with three options. First, we can cower or run away, which is, of course, what fear is all about and the behavior that courage strengthens us against. Eliminating that first option, then, two options remain, both of which involve courage. We can attack in the face of the danger of death, or we can hold fast and endure. Evidently, the first of these is the form courage typically takes on the battlefield, when we are fighting a just fight with swords and spears. But, says Aquinas, actually endurance is the chief act of fortitude. He says this for three reasons. So there are three reasons why Aquinas thinks endurance rather than attacking is the better part of courage. First, because endurance seemingly implies that one is being attacked by a stronger person, whereas aggression denotes that one is attacking as though one were the stronger party. And it is more difficult to contend with a stronger than a weaker. Secondly, because he that endures already feels the presence of danger, whereas the aggressor looks upon danger as something to come, and it is more difficult to be unmoved by the present than by the future. Thirdly, because endurance implies length of time, whereas aggression is consistent with sudden movements, and it is more difficult to remain unmoved for a long time than to be moved suddenly to something arduous. These 3 points give room for what happens next in the Summa. So most of the quotes that I'm using so far are from the Summa Theologiae. Aquinas replaces the idea inherited from the Greeks that death in battle is the highest, most paradigmatic act of courage, with the Christian idea that, in fact, the highest act of courage or fortitude is discovered in the acts of the martyr. The martyr endures rather than attacks. As she does, she contends as the weaker party against the stronger. As well, she lives with the presence of death, knowing that it may come sooner or later, depending on the whim of the stronger one. And in this presence of the threat of death, she remains unmoved, often for a very long time. The next question in the Summa is entitled simply Martyrdom. In it, Aquinas begins by building on the first point above, namely that the paradigmatic acts of courage are not to be confined to the fields of Gettysburg or the valley of the Jezreel. So he says, it belongs to fortitude to strengthen man in the good of virtue, especially against dangers and chiefly against dangers of death, and most of all against those that occur in battle. Now it is evident that in martyrdom, man is firmly strengthened in the good of virtue, since he cleaves to faith and justice, notwithstanding the threatening danger of death, the imminence of which is moreover due to a kind of particular contest with the persecutors. Hence, Cyprian says in a sermon, so we're quoting Aquinas again, quoting Cyprian, the crowd of onlookers wondered to see an unearthly battle and Christ's servants fighting erect, undaunted in speech, with souls unmoved and strength divine. That's Cyprian's description of the martyrs. Cyprian's language here, which explicitly compares martyrdom to soldiers fighting a battle, is common in many early accounts of martyrdom in the Christian tradition. The battle, though, is not with swords and spears, but speech and heart, weapons of the Spirit. Regarding Aquinas' second point about enduring courage as opposed to attacking, Aquinas states clearly that the martyrs show the former as opposed to the latter. Again, quoting Aquinas. The chief act of fortitude is endurance. To this, and not to its secondary act, which is aggression, martyrdom belongs. And since patience serves fortitude on the part of its chief act, that is, endurance, hence it is that martyrs are also praised for their patience. Taken together, the various arguments Aquinas has given put him in the place where he can conclude emphatically that, quote, of all the virtuous acts, martyrdom is the greatest proof of the perfection of charity. So that's Aquinas on courage. Let me now turn to the Greek inheritance, which informed Aristotle's thinking. So we're going to take a look back and ask then, well, Aquinas changed something. What did he change? And in particular, I'd like to consider the Iliad. We have spoken about the Greek inheritance regarding virtue. For Aquinas, this is most strongly from Aristotle. What we have seen so far is that with respect to courage, he needed to work a change, fundamentally qualifying Aristotle's view that the essence of courage is to be discovered in war. He did this because, as a Christian, he was an inheritor, as we are, of the tradition and stories of the martyrs, an inheritance Aristotle lacked. Here we might ask, what is the shape of Aristotle's inheritance about courage? If not of martyrs such as Stephen or Justin or Perpetua, all who in their enduring courage mirrored their Lord Christ. Whom did Aristotle have in mind as he spoke of courage? Aristotle frequently provides examples, but he gives fewer than we might wish when he speaks of courage. Yet, as he moves to discuss cases of what people sometimes call courage, he thinks it's not quite fully courage, he takes his first example from Homer's Iliad. He refers there to the case of the citizen soldier who fights with courage of a certain sort, but one degree of indirection. For instance, they fight gallantly because they might one day be shamed for not doing so. So it's a little bit like courage, but not quite exactly. It is not surprising that the Iliad was in Aristotle's mind as he spoke of courage in battle. It was a prime Greek inheritance whose subject from start to finish is war. The action of the poem moves back and forth between the Trojan forces who, rallied by Hector, valiantly defended their besieged city, and the invading Achaeans, whose champion, the great Achilles, mightiest of all, stirs to a murderous, violent rage against the Trojans, only as the story nears its end. The advantage seesaws through the poem, which gives a chance for Homer to tell the tale of the death in battle of first one great hero, then on to the next, and the next, and the next. In each case, whether by its exemplification or its negation, he displays what he seems to believe courage is. For illustration, consider the encounter between Sarpedon, king of Lycia, and Patroclus, the best friend of Achilles. Patroclus prevails in that showdown, which means that Sarpedon dies. Although, as Homer reminds us frequently as the scene progresses, Patroclus, too, is soon to die. The scene begins when Sarpedon spies Patroclus, killing with great force and abandon, scattering the Trojans. Now when Sarpedon, so now I'm quoting from the Iliad, when Sarpedon saw his comrades, men who wore ungirded tunics, become overcome by Patroclus, he rebuked the Lycians, saying, "Shame on you! Where are you flying to? Show your mettle. I will myself meet this man in fight and learn what it is that is so masterful." He sprang from his chariot as he spoke, and Patroclus, when he saw this, leapt onto the ground also. The two of them rushed at one another with loud cries, like eagle-beaked, crook-taloned vultures that scream and tear at one another in some high mountain fastness. The two champions fight, others fall around them as their glancing blows catch them unawares, and then Patroclus finds his aim. Patroclus, quoting again from the Iliad, aimed in his turn, and the spear sped not from his hand in vain, for he hit Sarpedon just where the midriff surrounds the ever-beating heart. He fell like some oak or silver poplar or tall pine to which woodsmen have laid their axes upon the mountains to make timber for shipbuilding. Even so did he lie stretched in full length in front of his chariot and horses, moaning and clutching at the blood-stained dust. As he died, Sarpedon called to his trusty comrade and said, "Glaucus, my brother, hero among heroes, put forth all your strength, fight with might and main. Now, if ever, quit yourself like a valiant soldier. First go among the Lycian captains and bid them fight for Sarpedon. Then yourself also do battle to save my armor from being taken." Death closed his eyes as he spoke. Patroclus planted his heel on his breast and drew the spear from his body, whereon his senses came out along with it, and he drew out both spear point and Sarpedon's soul at the same time. So the Iliad, by the way, is so graphic, but it's extraordinary. I can't but quote it at some length. Because we need to feel the spirit, I think, of what Homer's writing of and what's behind it. What is the sort of courage that we're seeing in these battles? So this is a grim scene, to be sure, but the courage of the Homeric kind infuses it. Sarpedon is courageous as he chastises his colleagues for their lack of it, and as he attacks, facing down the murderous Patroclus. In the battle, neither flinches, although both know death waits at their elbows, with certainty for one or the other, for only one can prevail. It is Patroclus who prevails, at least this time, as the mighty Sarpedon falls like a stately tree. But even in death, he cries out for more courage from his comrades, urging them especially to care for his body and his armor, lest they become a means of Achaean glory. The scene just recounted is typical in the Iliad. War heroes courageously kill and then soon enough courageously die. This happens to Patroclus soon as he falls to Hector. As it turns out, this is the crucial swing point of the story, since it arouses the sullen Achilles, who loves Patroclus with a deep and abiding love. The culminating battle scene or battle sequence takes Achilles like a tornado through the Trojan forces, finally to find and kill Hector, mightiest of King Priam's sons. As the enraged Achilles hunts, so we're moving ahead just a little bit in the Iliad, for Hector, he comes upon another of Priam's sons, Lycaon, who is scrambling along the banks of the river Scamander. Knowing he is greatly outmatched, Lycaon grasps Achilles by the knee and bargains for his life, reminding Achilles what a high price his ransom will bring. In a voice of iron, Achilles responds. Another long quote. "Idiot," said he, "talk not to me of ransom. Until Patroclus fell, I preferred to give the Trojan quarter and sold beyond the sea many of those whom I had taken alive. But now not a man shall live of those whom heaven delivers into my hands before the city of Ilius. And of all Trojans it shall fare hardest with the sons of Priam. Therefore, my friend, you too shall die. Why should you whine in this way? Patroclus fell, and he was a better man than you are. I too. See you not how I am great and godly? I am son to a noble father and have a goddess for my mother. But the hands of doom and death overshadow me, all as surely. The day will come, either at dawn or dusk, or at noontide, when one shall take my life also in battle, either with his spear or with an arrow sped from his bow. Thus did he speak, and Lycaon's heart sank within him. He loosed his hold of the spear and held out both hands before him. But Achilles drew his keen blade and struck him by the collarbone of his neck. He plunged his two-edged sword into him to the very hilt, whereupon he lay at full length on the ground with the dark blood welling from him till the earth was soaked. Then Achilles caught him by the foot and flung him into the river to go downstream, vaunting over him the while and saying, "Lie there among the fishes, who will lick the blood from your wound and gloat over it. Your mother shall not lay you on any bier to mourn you, but the eddies of the Scamander will bear you into the broad bosom of the sea." End quote. Like the Lycians whom Sarpedon shames, Lycaon demonstrates cowardice on the ultimate Homeric proving ground of courage, impending death in the battlefield. As such, he deserves Achilles' disdain, which in the Homeric lexicon is far worse than his double-edged sword. The disdain Achilles feels for the cowardly Lycaon extends to his treatment of his corpse. Lycaon deserves to be nibbled by the fish in the sea, for he grew faint at the specter of his own death. By contrast, Achilles, paragon of virtue, paragon of courage, looks unblinkingly into its grim face. He does so looking backward and forward, recalling the courageous death of his dear friend Patroclus and anticipating his own. As Achilles sees himself in this way, now a killer, only later to be killed, we wonder about the true shape of the Homeric world that surrounds him. Achilles is surely the human hero of the Iliad, but can he be its hero really? For as he speaks here, he is an instrument of death, soon enough to be to himself be felled by another instrument. Accordingly, Simone Weil has argued, in a lovely little article on the Iliad, Simone Weil has argued that the true hero of the Iliad is not human at all. Here is what she says. The true hero, the true subject, the center of the Iliad is force. Force employed by man, force that enslaves man, force before which man's flesh shrinks away. In this work, at all times, the human spirit is shown as modified by its relations to force, as swept away, blinded by the very force it imagined it could handle. Weil's force is neither benevolent nor personal. In fact, its key property is that at death it turns a man into a thing. Commenting on this very scene where Achilles kills Lycaon, Weil notes that as the latter accedes to the former at that moment as death sets upon him, still breathing, says Weil, he is simply matter. Still thinking, he can think no longer. Force, here wielded by Achilles, has turned Lycaon to matter, to corpse, to dust. And this, as Achilles perceives, can be avoided by no one. The fate awaits him as well. This is a grim outlook, no doubt, although it is a kind of justice, or there is a kind of justice in it, as Weil points out. As she says, by its very blindness, destiny establishes a kind of justice. Blinded also is she who decrees to warriors punishment in kind. He that takes the sword will perish by the sword. The Iliad formulated the principle long before the Gospels did, and in almost the same terms. Ares is just and kills those who kill. So the final section of the paper, which is a little bit longer, is about war and death in the Old Testament, now that we've heard about it in the Iliad. Weil's reference to the Gospels, of course, is to what Jesus says to the sword-wielding disciple in the garden. He who lives by the sword shall die by the sword, in Matthew. His saying it in this context quite clearly offers another way, something one does not find in the Iliad. This other way, the way of the cross, is also the way of the martyrs. Aquinas had other material to draw on about courage than did Aristotle, for whom the Iliad was his main source, notably the Gospels and the stories of the martyrs. On this basis, he reconfigured courage, as we've seen. But a question for us in this section of the paper, and really in this colloquium, is in what sense and to what degree are the seeds of this reconfiguration present in Israel's tradition before Christ and the martyrs? We don't really have martyr stories in the Old Testament, although that, as Ephraim says, all these points are debated. But we do have war stories. And if Aristotle and Aquinas are right that courage takes its definition from the dangers of death that arise in war and death on the battlefield, then how do we find courage portrayed in and around those biblical stories of war and death on the battlefield? And how does that portrayal compare with what we find in the Iliad? And so here is a place for me to remind you that I'm a moral theologian, not a scripture scholar. I'm a reader of the Bible, as we all are. But what I'd like to do is think a little bit about particularly what I'll call the former prophets, sometimes referred to as the Deuteronomistic history, to think about courage as it's portrayed about war in the Old Testament. So Homer's compositions can be dated to the 8th century BC, the time of the divided kingdom in Israel. In that century, both Israel and Judah are involved in a variety of skirmishes with rival nations, and the century ends with the fierce Assyrian assault. If it is historical, the Trojan War, which Homer chronicles, likely occurred roughly 4 centuries earlier, approximately the time of the conquest of Canaan in the biblical story. This span of time was, indeed, a time of war and rumors of war, both for the Israelites in the western reaches of the eastern reaches of the Mediterranean and the island peoples of its northern regions. The Iliad is really about nothing but war. The biblical texts spanning this time are about many things, but surely war is quite prominent among them. Texts in this category include the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. As I referred to them, I'll call them, for the purposes of this paper, the former prophets. Now, there is a debate about just how historical these books actually are, a debate we can leave here aside, since our concern is about what is in the stories about war and courage and how that compares with the Iliad. So the former prophets have their share of gore. Not just a few men die in battle, and there are war heroes. Yet one has to look very hard to find the kind of scene so common in the Iliad, which is why I read those so graphically. Where one warrior confronts another, they clash, and the stronger overcomes the weaker, killing him in cold blood, glorying over his corpse. What do we hear instead about war? Well, there's war strategy, as with Gideon, and preparation for battle, as with Joshua or Saul, who perform religious rituals before entering the fray, and there are descriptions of how one or the other battle progresses. And of course, there is a great deal about God, whether he has given the enemy into Israel's hand or not, and about why he has or has not. Yet once again, individual contests, or the display of the might and courage of one or the other great hero, which Homer so relishes, are held to a bare minimum. Almost never do we witness a showdown between champions. Joab kills Abner, Abimelech his brothers, Absalom Amnon, but these are usually a matter of one man tricking or surprising the other. We do feel death on the battlefield in Israel's war stories, but in a more distant way than that which predominates in the Iliad. Death is never the protagonist, nor do we feel it as a force that moves back and forth, wielded first by one side as it kills, and then by the other. Deaths are occasionally graphically described, for example, that of the Moabite king Eglon, whose fat encloses Judge Ehud's blade. You remember that moment? But there is little sense of triumph in these episodes or glory over the body. Although, on one occasion, Joshua does string up the dead bodies of 5 Canaanite kings and, interestingly, tries to instill courage in his soldiers by having them place their feet on the dead kings' necks. More often, though, death is a statistic. So, for example, from 1 Samuel, there was a great slaughter, and there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. On at least 3 occasions, we are brought close to a death in battle when men wish and act toward what they think of as a noble or nobler death in battle. Abimelech, who wishes not to be known as one who died at the hand of a woman. Saul, who, like Sarpedon, is concerned not to be made sport of by the Philistines. And Samson, who died with the Philistines as he pulled down the building around them all. All of these men, however, fall far short of being portrayed as courageous heroes in the biblical account. In fact, they are much closer to scoundrels. I can think of 2 places in the literature of the former prophets, and perhaps we can think of others, where we are treated to a contest in which one mighty Israelite soldier beats the enemy. One is when Jonathan climbs with his armor-bearer into a crowd of Philistine soldiers who are armed and ready. Jonathan and his armor-bearer kill 20 of them. In this brief story, there is some trash talk from the Philistines before the contest, something that is common in the stories of the Iliad. But the taunt from the Philistines does not function this way for Jonathan. Rather, he takes it as a sign that God is with him. As he says earlier, it may be that the Lord will act for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. So Jonathan's success in battle is attributable not to his own prowess, but to God's accompaniment. Of course, the one main war contest, man to man, is the showdown between David and Goliath. It is immensely popular, which may suggest a thirst for the kind of war stories that we have in the Iliad, concentrated for Bible readers in one spot. It is the most like the many stories from the Iliad. 2 champions trade insults as they move into battle. The victorious blow is explicitly described, and David stands victorious over the fallen Goliath. Quote, David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grasped his sword, drew it out of its sheath and killed him, and then he cut off his head with it. But these details are there, but they pale in comparison to the elaborate battle descriptions one finds in the Iliad. Yet there is a further point to notice as we take a next step in thinking about how war stories function in the former prophets, differently from how they function in the Iliad. For while we happily lift this story out of its context in Sunday school lessons, in the biblical narrative, context is everything. The writer of this story is interested in much more than the showdown. Like the Jonathan story, one facet of the broader interest is God's accompaniment. Goliath disrespects the Lord of Israel, and Israelites should not stand for this. David is the only one who acts, which attests not only to his courage but also to his faith. David kills Goliath not because he is strong and mighty, but because the Lord is with him. But beyond that, as any careful reader of this story knows, a far more intricate plot lies underneath it. Saul is diminishing, while David is increasing, as the crowd of dancing women who later celebrate the victory indicate when they sing, Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. Indeed, as we tell it in Sunday school, we cut the story down by half, eliminating all the interactions between David and the Israelite soldiers before the showdown, wherein we learn that about all of the riches that are to come to the one who kills Goliath. David asks specifically about these, which suggests he may have mixed motives as he so bravely challenges the giant Philistine. Here we come upon a point that Robert Alter makes in his well-known The Art of Biblical Narrative. Interestingly, Alter also spends considerable time contrasting the Iliad with these stories from the former prophets. He draws attention to what he calls the artful reticence of the biblical authors, especially the narrator of David's story. Every biblical author, says Alter, is of course omniscient, but in contrast, for example, to the narratives of the Homeric poems, who makes his characters beautifully perspicuous, even as in the Iliad, when he is dealing with the most darkly irrational impulses of the human heart. As opposed to that, the ancient Hebrew narrator displays his omniscience with a drastic selectivity. For instance, in the scene referenced earlier when Achilles disdains the cowardly Lycaon, plunges his sword deep in him and casually flicks his body into the river, he becomes in that moment utterly transparent. His emotions are chilling, but they are clearly portrayed. By contrast, in the biblical story of David, we are offered truthful, and possibly revealing snapshots of what David does. For instance, how he summons Bathsheba for sex. But these are episodic, and we quickly pass to another scene, so we're left to think about what, in fact, is the character we're being presented with. The point for our purposes as we consider biblical courage is that a space is opened by this reticence for us to wonder about the motives and even the heart of these characters who appear in the most vaunted roles. The stories are told in such a way that we have room to be suspicious of the greatest achievements, such as David's brave, mighty victory over Goliath. This stops short of an overt cynicism. It is better characterized by St. Paul's phrase, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Which also means, what it also means is that hope for the future, and this is always present, hope is always present in the biblical narratives, is not carried by the great ones in the story, like David, but rather by the God who is bringing it about. Here we can see a stark contrast to the force that Veil feels at the root of the Iliad. The force operates blindly, even if fairly, raising one proud hero only to topple him as he falls lifeless to the ground, victim to the next hero. The God of the Hebrews, by contrast, carries forward a drama into which characters like David, despite his foibles, is properly fitted and even redeemed, not by his own power, but by grace. An outcome is that the courage Aquinas labeled attacking or aggressive courage is qualified, if not entirely undercut, by the suspicion of the biblical text as it opens up regarding the mighty deeds of the powerful. Put simply, Achilles would never make it into the Bible. The rawness and purity and single-mindedness of his wrath and his pride and the fiery certainty of his path to death, which only fuels his certainty in killing, is, after all, not really human. Moreover, it is sinful to the degree that it, even briefly, pridefully imagines it rules the day. David, surely the mightiest of biblical heroes, who sometimes demonstrates attacking or aggressive courage, has clay feet. A very human thing to have. David's courage in battle with Goliath is a mighty display, no doubt, perhaps glorious for the moment, but it is mixed and will not last. We need something more solid, something that can extend through life and even to death. But let us take notice of a second episode in David's life, the story of David and Bathsheba. The story involves a battle, a death in battle, but it is not David's, but rather Uriah's, Bathsheba's husband. As the story goes, David summons Uriah the Hittite from the battlefield, where he is fighting in David's army, and tells him to go home to sleep with his wife. This is after David has already taken her to his bed, and as he has recently discovered, actually impregnated her. David is covering his tracks, and by deception, attempting to eliminate an annoying little obstacle. One might call this a cowardly thing to do. But as he is foiled in his plans by the solidity of Uriah's character, as Uriah says, so remember Uriah objects to David's plan, the ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go home to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will do no such thing, says Uriah to David. Uriah's death comes soon after, when the scheming David writes a letter to his general Joab, sending Uriah into the heat of the battle. The letter is carried from David to Joab by none other than the faithful Uriah, like an innocent lamb led to the slaughter. The Bible does not tell us the details of his death, but it has given us enough to call Uriah courageous. His commitments to the ark, Israel, and his general and comrades hold him fast. He can choose no other path, even if this one leads into mortal danger. Later, Christian martyrs will be marked by their refusal to do what those who have power over them command, precisely because they know the thing commanded is an affront to God and a violation of their own most fundamental and sustaining convictions. Uriah, a common soldier, in fact, a non-Israelite, stands in a long tradition of biblical characters, including a number in the Old Testament. One might think here of Naboth or Jeremiah or Daniel, who refused to buckle to the pressures placed on them by the powerful who seek to displace their faith. We do not need to call these martyrs in order to recognize that the biblical story holds them up as courageous. Yet the courage they display is best described as enduring courage. In this way, it is like the courage of the martyrs. Why so? To return to Aquinas' typology, as they display their courage, these ones are on the short side of power. Uriah is like a little plastic soldier to David, who can do with him whatever he chooses. Daniel and his friends are entirely at the mercy of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who blithely sends them to their desks, even if they miraculously escape. As well, the enduring courage that such biblical characters display stretches out over time, both in the sense that it is present to them continually, for they do not, like Achilles, or for that matter David, choose the time of their attack. Their resistance arises out of a character that is developed and tested over time. The test that comes to Naboth, for instance, when King Ahab decides he wants his land, only brings to the surface what is constant in his life, loyalty to the land and to his ancestors. Naboth dies as he lived, by a commitment over a long time to the same thing. We need not call him a martyr to say that his courage is like a martyr. It opens room in the biblical story for the recognition of the courage of the martyrs. Now, by way of conclusion, when I was writing this, I thought, okay, now time to conclude. But then I also thought, what about the Maccabees? And so then I thought, actually, to think about the Maccabees is almost really essential, I think, in a colloquium like this. So just a few words about that and trying to draw it to a conclusion. Any discussion of martyrdom or its roots in the Old Testament is incomplete without some reference to the books of the Maccabees, and we have yet to speak of them. These books appear neither in the Hebrew canon nor the Protestant, where they are separated out as belonging to the Apocrypha. They are, though, canon for Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians, which means they were canon in the time for many of the Christian martyrs, beginning in the 2nd century A.D. and extending through the Middle Ages. These books include, indeed mingle, dying for the faith, that is Jewish faith, and killing for it. 2 Maccabees 6 tells the story of an old scribe, Eleazar, who dies at the hand of the Seleucid officials and soldiers, whose job it is to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their ancestors. Chapter 7 follows with the story of 7 brothers and their mother who are compelled by the king under torture with whips and thongs to partake of unlawful swine's flesh. All the brothers die in a horrible way, including literally by being fried in a very large fry pan. Each is offered a chance to recant by his torturers, but stalwartly refuses, showing, as the text tells us, great courage. In the final scene, the mother speaks privately to her 7th son, the last one left, in this manner. "Do not fear this butcher," she says, "but prove worthy of your brothers. Accept death so that in God's mercy I may get you back again along with your brothers." And so he speaks boldly to all assembled. The 7th brother does. "What are you waiting for? I will not obey the king's command, but I obey the command of the law that was given to our ancestors through Moses. He and his mother are killed for their loyalty to God's law, courageously resisting those with power over them." These stories are important for their quite explicit invocation of an afterlife in which their protagonists will be blessed. As well, the resemblance of these stories to those of the Christian martyrs is striking. This is not lost on early Christian authors who praised Christian martyrs. Both Origen and Eusebius of Caesarea used the brothers, the brothers in Maccabees 2, and their mother as models for the martyrdom of Christians in Lyon and Vienna in 177 AD. This led in the 4th century, as cults of veneration of the saints and martyrs began to grow, to the very interesting questions of whether Jews could be venerated by Christians. We need not settle this matter, the matter of whether Eleazar and the 7 brothers and their mother are properly called martyrs by Christians, in order to say, with the help of Aquinas, that they displayed the courage of the martyrs in its highest form, namely the courage of endurance. Indeed, the distinction is helpful as we move on in 2 Maccabees, in the very next chapter, to the story of Judas Maccabeus, valiant in battle, who is able with a single nod, Judas Maccabeus, valiant in battle, who rallies his troops with these words, quote from Judas, "We trust in the Almighty God, who is able with a single nod to strike down those who are coming against us, and even, if necessary, the whole world." These words, according to the text, fill his soldiers, quote, with great courage, and made them ready to die for their laws and their country. Subsequently, Judas divides his army into 4 parts, appointing his brothers over each. These brothers and their men move bravely into battle, both killing and dying for their faith. killing and dying for their faith. Yet evidently they do not do so with the courage of endurance demonstrated by the other set of brothers in the previous chapter, but rather by the aggressive, attacking form of courage. But to conclude, I think we can say this is not the courage of Christ. As noted earlier in the garden, when one of his disciples strikes out with a sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest, Jesus rebukes him, saying, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Simone Weil, as we recall, reads this point into the Iliad. Its seesaw of lethal violence follows exactly this pattern. Like Patroclus and so many others in that epic poem of war, first you kill with a sword, and then soon enough you are killed. But in the Iliad, there is really no alternative. And so courage offers its heroes no other option but to bravely keep in the cycle, grim though it may be. Not so with the followers of Christ, who come to see in his death and resurrection the courage of the martyrs. Indeed, we understand that the killing of power of kings and generals, strong though it may be, is not the greatest power we know. There is another stronger, the power of the cross, by which we also know who alone is worthy to open the book of life, namely the Lamb that was slain. Thank you very much.